Good afternoon, everyone. You're all very welcome to this live event to formally launch the joint Oxfam Ireland Trócaire report, Sustainable Food Systems, Steps Ireland Can Take to Become a Global Leader. We have a lot of interest in this report and we have some really great speakers to discuss it with you today. And also, of course, we really encourage your own participation. So you're all very welcome. It's great to have you here. The Irish government has set out the commendable ambition to become a global leader in sustainable food systems over the next decade. Given Ireland's commitments to the right to food, the European Green Deal and the Paris Agreement on climate change, our report assesses where Ireland is at and what Ireland needs to do in both the domestic and international spheres to achieve this ambition. The sustainable transformation of the global food system presents an immense challenge. The global food system is at the center of complex, interconnected challenges, including climate change, ecological degradation, land use competition, and conflict. An increasing number of people are facing food insecurity, a trend that has been further exacerbated by COVID-19, and you'll be aware of some of the extreme food crises emerging around the world, with the climate change and biodiversity emergencies further underpinning arguments for agricultural and food system transformation. The world faces the unprecedented challenge of pursuing human development and ensuring the right to food for all on a planet where the population is estimated to increase to over 9 billion people by 2050 in ways that don't breach essential ecological and planetary boundaries, whilst also tackling poverty and extreme inequality. COVID-19 has underlined the urgent need for a fundamental transformation of our global food system to ensure better stewardship of our natural resources and better responses to the many challenges we face. Our food system needs to operate within a safe and just operating space for us to have any chance of achieving the vision of the Sustainable Development Goals. Though our global food system produces volumes of food never before imagined, the negative impacts of current unsustainable production approaches make for sobering reading. Human activity has degraded about a quarter of the planet's land area not covered by ice. The extinction rate of species is now estimated at between 100 and 1,000 times that of pre-industrial levels. As well as the many negative environmental impacts, the global food system also poses many significant health hazards, exemplified in the rise of emerging infectious diseases such as COVID-19. Half of the emerging zoonotic diseases between 1940 and 2005 have been attributed to changes in land use, intensive agricultural practices, especially livestock production and food production. While cheap and available to some, an ongoing failure of the global food system concerns the supply and access to nutritious foods for healthy living. We know that about 9% of the world's population is undernourished to various degrees, with those facing severe food shortages increasing, while another 13% of adults globally are obese. At the heart of this system is inequality. Inequality of power, inequality of voice, inequality of resources and access to resources, and inequality of choice. A recent Oxfam report, Not in This Together, documented that during the pandemic, publicly listed supermarkets distributed 98% of net profits to their shareholders via dividends and share buybacks. Meanwhile, workers and food producers, especially women, across the globe, the people we've called essential or frontline workers, have seen their incomes stagnate or even fall, while their rights continue to be eroded and violated. A recent survey of 350 food and agricultural companies found that half of those assessed do not disclose targets or report on progress to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and over a third do not sufficiently acknowledge their responsibility to ensure the human rights of workers in their supply chain are respected, nor do they demonstrate any intention of helping to improve the livelihoods of smallholder farmers. Moving towards sustainable food systems requires transformation of this system and strategies grounded in principles of social equity, women's empowerment, economic security, and environmental regeneration. Both Oxfam Ireland and Trócaire work in countries where agriculture and food are the main sources of income generation and employment, and where small-scale farms account for most of the food consumed in the local community, making their futures reliant on building their food security and strengthening their resilience to climate and other shocks. Since the food price crisis of 2007 and 2008, momentum has been building towards an alternative vision for agriculture and food systems. a transformative approach that is pro-poor and pro-environment, that seeks not only to be productive, but also advances rural development, as well as environmental and social justice outcomes. For this to happen, we need an appropriate enabling environment that supports this change. The forthcoming UN Food Systems Summit is one forum that could bring about this transformative change, but many in global civil society are concerned that such transformative change isn't even on the agenda. We're now going to show a small video just to illustrate what people are feeling about it.
Sorry, folks.
Technology is great when it works. Here we go.
The UN
The UN is organizing a food systems summit to attempt to transform the way the world produces, consumes, and thinks about food. The summit claims it will deliver game-changing solutions and promote healthier and more sustainable food systems. Yet many questions have been raised about the summit. Why do private foundations have so much influence? Why are human rights not central to the debates? Are the proposed solutions truly transformative? Or do they actually promote industrial agriculture and big data? Who is really participating in the dialogues at the summit?
It is supposed to be a very open and inclusive process, so almost anyone can submit ideas about how to transform food systems.
This may seem like a good thing, but in practice it enables powerful groups to exercise undue influence. Here is why. The summit is an example of multi-stakeholderism. Multi-stakeholderism fails to recognize that small-scale food producers, indigenous peoples, NGOs, states, research institutes, and the private sector don't have the same opportunities to influence debates. It's a bit counterintuitive, but in organizing open dialogues, the summit actually excludes the voices of those most affected by hunger.
Why is it then that proposals like phasing out pesticides, redistributing concentrated land ownership, or holding companies accountable for their environmental and labor abuses are not on the table? It doesn't make sense to call a dialogue open and inclusive if certain perspectives are excluded, if the agenda was set from the beginning by actors protecting corporate interests.
The UN Committee on World Food Security has a model for ensuring the equal and self-organized participation of those most affected by food insecurity. But the UN Food Systems Summit has consistently sidelined the World Committee on Food Security, which was not even part of the summit organization at the start.
This is why over 500 civil society organizations have raised the alarm and are calling for action. Their voices must be heard.
What we need from governments is urgent regulatory action to hold corporations to account and uphold the rights of peoples. And the UN Food Systems Summit is not designed to deliver this.
Thank you very much. I hope everybody got that. Apologies about the little technical hiccup at the start. Also conscious that I didn't introduce myself at the start. So I'm Jim Clark, and the CEO of Oxfam Ireland. And again, you're all very welcome. I want to now introduce our moderator for the day, Ella McSweeney. Ella is a journalist and reporter focusing on farming, food and ecology. She works for the BBC, RTE and the Guardian newspaper, and then has written extensively on our national and global food systems. She's an academic background in science and a master's in food policy. We're delighted to have you here, Ella, and thank you so much, and over to you.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Jim, and I'd like to welcome everyone who's joined us. It's just my pleasure to be here with you this afternoon from now until 4 o'clock, and I'm really looking forward to listening myself to the discussions. You know, obviously the question of how Ireland can become a global leader in sustainable food systems is in many ways, with our climate and biodiversity crisis and also the inequality that you mentioned, Jim, it is the most urgent of goals. We have an awful lot of people registered for this event from all sectors, including academics, researchers, civil society actors, food producers, agri-food businesses, political leaders and government agencies, along with, I hope, ordinary citizens who are also invested in this discussion, in this process. And we hope you'll find this a valuable addition to the many discussions and conversations that have been happening in relation to this question. So we've got a super lineup. I want to welcome first Sinead Mould. She's the author of the joint Oxfam-Troca report, and she's going to provide us with an in-depth report of the findings, an in-depth overview, I should say, of the findings and the recommendations of this report first. And then we have a panel who are going to respond to the report from their own unique perspectives. And this panel is made up of Shefali Sharma, Director of the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, European Office, John Brennan, an organic farmer and member of Leitrim Organic Farmers Cooperative, Gertrude Trelawney Jabson, the country coordinator for the participatory ecological land use management in Zimbabwe, and Tom Arnold, who is Ireland's Special Envoy on Food Systems. And after we hear from our panelists, we want to bring all of you in. So I would encourage all of you, if you can, to use the Q&A function during this discussion and during the presentation to submit your questions and also your comments, if you want to make a comment or give an opinion that you have throughout the event. And we will make sure to represent them and put them to our speakers during the sort of Q&A session, which will happen before the closing remarks from Troca's CEO, Caoimhe de Barra, and that'll be at about 10 to 4. And just very quickly, we are, of course, recording this event, just to let you all know that. A copy of this recording is going to be sent to all of those who have registered, and it's also going to be posted on various online channels by both Oxfam and Troca. You find links to the report and summary in the chat box to the right of your screen right now. And if you are tweeting, I've been asked to make sure to ask you that, can you please use the hashtag Sustainable Food Systems. So I'm delighted now to introduce you to Sinead Mould, who's the author of Sustainable Food Systems: Steps Ireland Can Take to Become a Global Leader. Sinead is an independent consultant, research affiliate with the Cambridge Central Asia Forum, and an expert with the Natural Resource Institute at Greenwich University. And since 2007, her research has focused on sustainable development and food and nutrition security for rural and marginalised people. She's worked with many international organisations, think tanks, the private sector, NGOs, including UN agencies, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Brookings Institution, the European Commission, and the OECD. And her research aims to understand how complex sciences can be applied to policies relating to food systems and the hugely important issue of climate justice. She holds a Bachelor of Science in International Development of Food Policy from the University of College Cork, and also an MPhil in Development Studies from University of Cambridge. All in all, she's highly qualified to be able to present this report to you. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Sinead.
Super, thank you, Ella, for that very comprehensive introduction. So I'm just going to share my screen now. Can everybody see it? Can we see it?
Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, super. So Thank you everyone for making the time today to be part of this presentation. We're really thrilled to present the research, and especially on such a sunny day, it means a lot to everyone who's made the time. So what we're hoping you take away from today's presentation is first the context in which this report was commissioned. So we'll briefly run through the global and national contexts in which this report was commissioned, and I'll touch on the scope and the approach we took to the research. We'll then have a look at some of the different perspectives that emerged relating to Ireland's approach to food systems. And following that, we'll run through some of the main findings that emerged, classified by their economic, social, and environmental dimensions, and touch on some of the relevant recommendations throughout. I'm going to finish up the presentation with a brief overview of the recommendations that cut across all three dimensions of sustainability, including accountability and governance dimensions. Now, I won't be going into the detailed 22 recommendations that we have in the report, but I invite you to have a look at the report and do feel free to get in touch. My contact details are on this presentation, and I believe we'll be sharing that as well. So if we start with the global context, as most of you on this call will be aware, the report was commissioned ahead of the UN Food System Summit that's happening this September. And this is the 5th such global summit that's taken place over the last 50 years. And importantly, it reflects a global paradigm shift in how we perceive and how we deal with food systems. This paradigm shift is partially reflected in this new conceptualization of food and nutrition security, which you see here on your screen, I hope. Because last year, the Committee on Food Security's high-level panel of experts added 2 components to what it means to achieve food and nutrition security: sustainability and agency. So sustainability refers to the long-term ability of food systems to provide food and nutrition security in a way that does not compromise the economic, social, and environmental bases that generate this food and nutrition security for future generations. Agency refers to the capacity of individuals or groups to make their own decisions about what foods they eat, the foods they produce, how that food is produced, processed, and distributed within food systems, and importantly, their ability to engage in processes that shape food system policies and governance. And these 2 concepts are of particular importance for this report and presentation because they provide space for the power dimensions in our food systems to be considered, specifically through agency. And importantly, they recognize both the sectoral and the temporal interdependencies that are inherent in our food systems. So let's take a look at how this paradigm shift is reflected at the national level. So throughout this report, we used a mixed methods research approach, combining both quantitative and qualitative analysis. And we also included 21 semi-structured interviews with key stakeholders and experts in the field. We reviewed a whole range of national and EU policies, but we did place a specific emphasis on the draft Agri-Food Strategy 2030, particularly because it's perceived as the world's first national food systems action plan. And the strategy offers a new direction for Ireland's food system landscape. And the diagram in front of you shows all of the policies, strategies, legislation, and initiatives that are referenced in the Agri-Food Strategy. Now, don't worry if you can't see, depending on your screen size, this tiny text that comes up here, because the purpose of the image is to really illustrate the vast scope and complexity involved in developing such a strategy. And so it shows some, at least, of the connections and interdependencies that need to be considered when dealing with a sustainable food system. So, for example, we've got animal welfare, soils, forestry, we've even got digital infrastructure, which typically we wouldn't find in an agri-food strategy. Of course, we've got health, the health sector. And importantly, the agri-food strategy also considers the linkages between domestic and foreign policies, for example, through Ireland's development cooperation policy, A Better World. This is the first time the domestic-foreign connection has been made in this way in a policy. And so as such, throughout the report and this presentation, we'll be jumping a little bit between the domestic and the global spheres. So now let's take a look at the perceptions of Ireland's approach to food systems. So on the one hand, we have perspectives of Ireland as exemplary and as being a leader in the field. The UN Food and Agricultural Organization sees Ireland as a country once known for its great famine and now recognized as a leader in sustainable, climate-sensitive agriculture and food production. For the FAO, Ireland stands out as an example of the transformative power of agricultural development. We also have Origin Green described as the world's first national food and beverage sustainability agenda. And we'll come back to Origin Green a little later in the presentation as well. Ireland is also perceived as going above and beyond the EU minimum requirements when it comes to participatory decision-making processes. So the European Centre for Policy and Development Management, for example, perceives Ireland as being a leader when it comes to multi-stakeholder approaches, particularly based on Ireland's previous agri-food strategy engagement processes. On the other hand, we have a less glowing perspective. So as most of you are probably aware, the environmental pillar, which represents NGOs, environmental NGOs in Ireland, withdrew from the Agri-Food Strategy Committee in February of this year as they felt the draft strategy was woefully inadequate to meet the social and environmental challenges we face, and that it would simply be perpetuating business as usual, which to date has led to poor environmental outcomes. So it's within that context that we sought to investigate and understand the opportunities and challenges for Ireland to truly become a global leader in food systems, sustainable food systems. And so now we're going to have a look at some of the report's findings based on their economic, social, and environmental dimensions, both at the global and domestic levels. So starting with economic sustainability, we first aimed to gain insights into Ireland's public expenditure on agriculture. So how does Ireland spend its money on agriculture? And the figure on the left-hand side shows Ireland's domestic subsidies for agriculture classified by their levels of sustainability. Now, we're not going to go into the methodological details today, but please do feel free to check out the relevant annex in the report and get in touch with any queries. But to sum it up, the yellow part here, the 11% of this domestic pie chart, shows payments to agriculture that have an overarching agri-environmental goal. While the 8%, the smaller section here, shows payments which have at least a sustainability component, although not as a principal objective. The 81%, the vast majority of payments, refers to those payments with no agri-environmental component attached to them. The figure on the right-hand side is based on the same logic, but it shows Ireland's aid flows, its official development assistance. And this analysis was slightly more complicated because of the nature of the data, but we can still surmise insights which show that nearly 60% of Irish aid is directed towards agricultural projects, with no explicit focus on agri-environmental outcomes. So a very clear message emerges, which is that Ireland should invest more in projects that are most likely to have transformative impacts, meaning those projects that align with economic, social, and environmental sustainability goals. But we're going to take a look now at Ireland's aid flows from a different perspective, not just from the agri-environmental perspective. And so, using the same data set as we just saw in the prior figure, we used a framework analysis to consider Ireland's aid flows, meaning we let the data speak for itself to form these classifications that you see in front of you. And what emerges immediately is that Ireland tends to prioritize people, aligning with its A Better World policy and the Sustainable Development Goal principle of leaving no one behind, as well as the principles that underpin a just transition and agroecology. Ireland focuses on supporting the most vulnerable. And it does this through initiatives and projects that focus on equity and on the marginalized groups, inclusive and participative policies, and smallholder farmers. So this certainly supports Ireland's reputation as a strong and leading development cooperation partner, particularly when it comes to tackling hunger. So we'll now come back to the domestic sphere a little to consider where some of the economic and the social dimensions overlap. So the draft Agri-Food Strategy aims to align with the EU Farm to Fork strategy, which is part of the Green Deal. And it promotes a focus on shorter supply chains for rural revitalization and healthier diets. And so the table on the right here, it speaks a little to the challenges Ireland is facing in terms of diets and nutrition. A very large portion of Ireland's children are not consuming enough fruit and vegetables, and more than 1 in 10 consumes at least 1 carbonated drink per day. And more broadly, we know that more than half of Ireland's population is obese or overweight, and that non-communicable diseases are on the rise. Meanwhile, the figure on the left shows that Ireland's second and third largest fruit and veg imports, potatoes and apples, are produce that can easily be grown domestically, along with several other items on this list. So one of our recommendations is to increase investments in programs that are likely to bolster local supply chains, including horticulture, and more broadly, programs like the LEADER program, which encourages entrepreneurship and local supply chains. We understand the budgetary constraints that the government is operating within, but we highlight in the report a potential incoherence when it comes to the prioritization of funding. So obviously, the budget for horticulture comes from the Department of Agriculture, but so does the budget for greyhound racing. And currently, the Department of Agriculture allocates twice the amount of funding to greyhound racing as it does to horticulture. So our point is that we may want to reconsider even our priorities when it comes to allocating the department's budget to prioritize public support to areas that are likely to address all 3 dimensions of sustainability. So now let's take a look at some of the findings that overlap between social and environmental this time. So the pie chart on the left, the far left here, reflects Ireland's crop production on land that is not used for livestock. So it's a smaller portion of Irish land. But alongside the pie chart on the right, which is the Harvard recommended dietary intake, the 2 images together serve to highlight the lack of diversity in Irish agricultural production. So we're not suggesting that we should be dedicating 50% of our land to fruit and vegetables. But we are saying that these components, fresh vegetables and crops for human consumption, should be taking a larger share of this pie chart. And second, when it comes to linking agricultural production with health and the environment, plant-based diets emerge as a pathway towards sustainability. And this is definitely a valid approach, but at present, these narratives point to plant-based alternatives, which typically tend to focus on ultra-processed foods, which we can see here in this image as an example. And this is particularly relevant given the draft agri-food strategy's focus on reformulated foods as one pathway towards more sustainable and healthier diets. So we recommend greater nuance in these narratives, because plant-based diets do not and should not imply junk food, which is neither nutritionally nor environmentally sustainable. We'd also like to see more research into the nutritional and environmental impacts of these plant-based alternatives, particularly when they do refer to reformulated foods. In fact, just this week, a new paper came out and it addresses some of the issues with the current measures of sustainability of diets, and taking a more comprehensive approach to measuring the impacts of diet on the environment. It points to the fact that the most significant contributions to poor environmental outcomes come from foods that are not required as part of a healthy diet, essentially meaning junk food. Finally, we also recommend that creating a food subject in schools could help educate students and society on healthy diets and cooking options, so that we don't need to refer to these ultra-processed foods if we're looking to be healthier and more sustainable. We feel that a food subject in schools could help create the links between agriculture and human and environmental health, and also could promote reduced household food waste, which in turn could promote economic sustainability at the household level at least. So here we're moving on to the power dimensions through the lens of social sustainability. So we sought to assess the levels of agency in Irish decision-making processes, meaning the ability of citizens and groups to engage in processes that shape their food systems. And to do this, we looked at the makeup of the committees which inform the policies at the national and global level. The images on this slide show the breakdown of the of the Agri-Food Strategy Committee. It's a slightly unconventional approach that we've taken to this breakdown in terms of the institutions, but what emerges immediately is the greater representation from those with ties to the private sector, as well as the low representation from the complex environmental and health sectors, especially when we consider that one of these representatives withdrew, as we touched on earlier. And then digging into this private sector breakdown, we can see that the vast majority of these private sector entities were large companies with a minimum of 250 employees, but in fact, most of them had more than 500 employees. And we know that the private sector is going to be instrumental in transforming food systems. But the question here is the extent to which such large entities can reflect the interests of other Irish private stakeholders. And this is particularly important when we consider that in this smaller section of the pie chart, the small and medium enterprises, there was a consulting firm and a venture capital firm, which again, I would argue are not the best placed to speak for SMEs across Ireland. Finally, in light of the important role that women play along every stage of the food system, and that they represent more than 50% of the Irish population, we'd like to see a greater gender balance on these committees. But it is worth noting that while this pie chart shows that there's 2 men for every woman on the committee on the Agri-Food Strategy, this is actually an improvement from the prior strategy, which saw 3 men to every woman. And so we did the same exercise for Ireland's global policies, and these images here reflect the representation on Ireland's National Task Team on Rural Africa's committee, which provides recommendations for Ireland's new strategic relationship with Africa. And we recognize that it's certainly more complicated to gain the views of the stakeholders in the global context, both logistically, but also given the diversity of countries and communities involved in Ireland's development cooperation. But what we do want to highlight here is that there's just one representative on this committee from Africa. And whilst that diplomat may be in a position to speak on behalf of their country, it's definitely more challenging for them to reflect the views, the priorities of the communities in other countries. So we recommend greater efforts to be made in this regard, specifically to allow space for the stakeholders to have a say on decisions relating to their food systems and to express their priorities and their interests. And recognizing the complexity of this, we suggest that one way of doing this might be by establishing systematic and robust monitoring and evaluation mechanisms. By incorporating impact assessments that include feedback from the beneficiaries of Irish development cooperation, and again, to allow them to express their priorities for the future of their food systems. And while we're on the topic of Ireland's new strategic relationship with Africa, in the report, we raised the question of who's benefiting from this strategic shift. And just from the recent policy narratives that have emerged, such as the NTTRA that we just saw, or the African Agricultural Development Programme, the AADP, we see a risk of diverging from core development principles with a greater emphasis in the narratives on the use of development cooperation as a tool to benefit Irish business and trade, rather than emphasizing support to low-income countries to achieve locally owned sustainable food systems based on their specific climatic, cultural, and nutritional needs. And we do understand that national interests need to be considered in the development of these policies, particularly in light of the fact that the aim is to move Africa beyond aid. But our point is that the quality of development of Irish development cooperation risks being eroded here, and that in turn jeopardizes both Ireland's reputation and its own national interests in the long term. Also within these narratives, there's a focus on knowledge transfer to support agricultural development in low-income countries. And Ireland definitely has valuable expertise and skills to share, But to ensure that this knowledge sharing is not unidirectional, but rather promoting the co-production of knowledge, of local ownership of research and development and genetic diversity, we recommend placing greater prioritization on developing the research capacity in low-income countries. And so here we have 4 key components of a food and nutrition security system. And we see the smaller portions in grey and yellow here dedicated to research and extension. And so we're recommending increasing the share of investments there. Also in the report, we outline the highly uneven landscape in which agricultural trade, research and development currently operates, particularly under the World Trade Organization's rules and regulations. It's led to a landscape with an oligarchic type market control when it comes to agribusiness and the privatization of genetic diversity, which in turn has led to uniformity in terms of the crop varieties used for production, but also those crops that end up being researched. So we recommend that Ireland uses its position in the global spheres to advocate for more inclusive and fair agricultural trade spaces, including the reformation of the World Trade Organization TRIPS agreement, and at the national level to ratify the Nagoya Protocol, which aims to promote access to genetic resources and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from their utilization. In the same context, we also raise some of the issues with Irish agri-food exports. So the figure here shows, and the green part or the lower bar, for those who may not see the colours, Ireland is by far the largest exporter of dairy products to West Africa, as one example. These dairy products include fat-filled milk powders, which are arguably nutritionally inferior and environmentally damaging, as they can include palm oil, which we know is typically sourced from East Asia and is linked to deforestation and biodiversity loss. On top of that, these exports can create intense competition for dairy farmers in these countries, creating negative impacts on local markets, as has been shown to be the case in West Africa. Yet we don't see any provisions in the draft agri-food strategy nor in other policy documents to ensure that exporting companies support the development of local industries, in this case, dairy industries. So we recommend that the Irish government prioritise working with Irish companies to ensure that exporters first and at a minimum apply the policy coherence of do no harm. But second, to go further and aim to bolster the local markets in which they're trading. For example, by aligning with the ECOWAS target of sourcing 25% of dairy products from local milk collection by 2025. So now for the final part of our findings, we're going to come back to the domestic sphere and raise the question as to whether agri-environmental targets in Irish policies are ambitious enough. Now, we do go into this in more detail in the report, but for today's presentation, we're going to explore just 2 of the targets in the Acclimatized Roadmap, which is intricately interlinked with the agri-food strategy and aims to guide Irish agriculture towards a climate neutral food system by 2050. So a pretty exciting goal there. But the graph shows the current and projected trends in ammonia emissions from agriculture. And these emissions we know have detrimental impacts on biodiversity, water, soil, and air quality. And so the blue line represents where we would be going if no changes were made. The dotted orange line shows the trajectory we need to take to achieve the acclimatized target, which is roughly 107,000 tonnes of ammonia emissions by 2030. What emerges here when we add this little text box is the clear link between the policy decisions made in Foodwise 2025, which led to the promotion of dairy production, and as a result, this sharp and continuous increase in ammonia emissions. So we believe that a more ambitious target might have been to aim for the reduction of ammonia emissions to at least 2010 or 2011 emissions prior to the increase in dairy production. And therefore, we recommend immediately updating the Acclimatized Roadmap with this, or a more ambitious target. And there's another point to make here. The Agri-Food Strategy 2030 aims to ensure a supply of food that is trusted and valued at home and abroad. But we believe that Origin Green's role as the main body to monitor and track agri-environmental metrics jeopardizes this trust, and therefore the environmental and economic sustainability of the Irish agri-food sector. The legitimacy of Ireland's reputation depends on the quality and the transparency of sustainability monitoring processes. Yet, as a programme of Board BIA, Origin Green will be influenced by the agency's strategic direction, and Board BIA does not clearly place environmental sustainability in its top 4 strategic priorities. So the extent to which Origin Green can feasibly balance economic, social, and environmental sustainability dimensions becomes questionable. And on top of that, the current narratives in Ireland still suggest that Origin Green has been instrumental in driving environmental sustainability. Yet, looking at these ammonia emissions as one important indicator, and we do go into this in much more detail in the report, but just based on this one indicator, there's very little evidence to suggest that the environmental situation has improved since the launch of Origin Green. So we recommend that the mandate for monitoring and follow-up of agri-environmental sustainability should be held by an independent body, and we'll get to this in the recommendation section. And so finally, to finish up on the findings section, we question whether the ag climatized target for organic production is ambitious, bearing in mind that this target was developed in line with the EU Farm to Fork target of achieving 25% of EU agricultural area under organic production by 2030. So one perspective is this is most certainly an ambitious target. This graph here shows that the target represents more than a 5-fold increase in organic production compared to where we are today. But on the other hand, we're starting from a very low base. Ireland currently ranks 4th to last amongst its EU peers, with just 2.6% of its agricultural land dedicated to organic production. And this means that even if no other EU member state increased its agricultural production by 2030, which of course is highly unlikely, then Ireland would still be only slightly above the EU average, raising the question of leadership here. So we recommend that Ireland increases its investment in organic production, but this doesn't need to be limited to organic production itself. The Organic Review report suggests that there's actually a relatively low demand in Ireland for organic products, in part because of issues relating to price and the limited range of organic products. So the Department of Agriculture or other departments could consider investing in policies that stimulate demand, such as national campaigns to communicate the benefits of organic, or to mitigate the higher costs of organic products. And finally, in light of budgetary constraints, we again raise the question of prioritization and coherence, especially given the multi-layered benefits of organic, which is often associated with improved animal welfare, greater biodiversity, and even certain key components of social sustainability. So we question the Department of Agriculture, the allocation of the budget, which is 15% higher for greyhound racing compared to the budget allocated for organic production. So we're going to move on to the recommendations, as I said here, just looking at a couple of them which cross over these various dimensions. And so the first thing that we suggest is, beyond the UN Food System Summit and beyond the 4 comprehensive national dialogues that were organised in the lead up to the summit, we believe that the establishment of an independent national sustainable food systems body with a mandate to influence agri-food policy would be highly beneficial. We believe that it would provide a space for the voices of all stakeholders to be heard and integrated into decision-making, including the most marginalised in Irish society, which again, we go into further detail in the report on, and those beneficiaries and stakeholders abroad. Such a body could also provide space for adequate and formal mediation processes to manage the potential barriers to consensus, such as those we saw with the environmental pillar this year, or those that were mentioned in the video in the introduction of this presentation. It could also be a space to provide and consider coherence across sectors and policies, both domestic and foreign. As we saw, trust is an important component of a sustainable food system, and such a body could improve accountability and therefore trust and effective cooperation across institutions. And importantly, we believe that this entity could be responsible for tracking and following up on appropriate agri-food metrics. These metrics should be based on robust and scientific evidence from both environmental and social dimensions. And if Ireland is to demonstrate leadership, then these metrics should go beyond the classic measures of productivity, of yield and output, to consider the success of a food system based on its capacity to nourish people and bolster biodiversity, habitats and landscapes. We'd also like to see traditional knowledge incorporated into this scientific decision-making processes. And specifically in terms of the examples of farming that might achieve these nourishing people and planet components. We have examples of this even here in Ireland, which we highlight in the report. For example, the Burns High Nature Value Programme, or other approaches which are emerging, such as farming for nature, nature-based solution, etc. We also have examples that we can be inspired from to develop this an independent body. We could look at here, for example, the National Climate Advisory Council, or we can look to Scotland, to the Scottish Food Commission, which was established specifically to provide advice to the Cabinet Secretary on challenges facing Scotland's food culture. We'd also like to see greater emphasis on the importance of publicly owned and co-created research, including a greater focus on social innovation alongside the technological innovation, which tends to dominate the conversation or the solution. And we'd like to see investigations into regenerative agriculture as one potentially sustainable way forward that might also help us mitigate some of the challenges we're looking at in terms of our herd numbers, and is potentially the next step to organic production, which remains ultimately an output, not a result. And finally, we'd like to re-emphasize the need to promote human rights and environmental due diligence in all agri-food exports and trade, particularly as these are principles that underpin the just transition, agroecological principles, and what it means to become or to work towards a sustainable food system. So I'd like to leave you with a quote from David Nabarro, who says that you can't be a systems leader unless you really meet people where they are. And that requires a lot of radical listening and feeling. And I hope that that's what we see happening in Ireland over the next decade. So thank you all very much. And I look forward to the rest of this conversation. Over to you, Ella.
Sinead, thank you so much for that. A really clear overview of your report, which outlines some of the really stark challenges that are faced. Again, I just ask everyone to please use the Q&A section, which is just there at the bottom of the screen, to ask questions and to make comments as well. We're going to start now with some responses from our panel. We've asked our panelists to keep their remarks to about 5 to 7 minutes or so. And I'm delighted first to welcome Shefali Sharma. She's the director of the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy European Office. Her current work and publications focus on the economic, social and environmental impacts of the global meat and dairy industries. And she examines how international trade rules and global governance on food security and climate intersect with the sector. She established the Geneva office in 2000 and leads its trade information project, has done for many years. She's worked with several civil society organizations, such as the Malaysia-based Third World Network. And she also has an MPhil from the Institute of Development Studies in Sussex and a Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology from the College of William and Mary. So I'm delighted to hand you over to Shefali for her response to what she's just heard. Shefali.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and it's a pleasure to be on this panel and had the privilege to read this very detailed report. I was really impressed with the amount of work that went into it. My response to the recommendations and the findings is twofold. One is on the metrics issue, which was dealt with quite considerably in this previous presentation. The definition of sustainability and the issues around science and, how do we look at the science, who forms the science, et cetera. So, and the second is on the policy coherence between aspects of domestic policy, trade policy, and development. So on the first theme, I appreciated the emphasis in the report's recommendation to ensure Ireland is using appropriate sustainability metrics to monitor sector-wide progress and an independent and trusted mechanism to measure progress on transitioning to sustainable food production. I do find it interesting that it was interesting to see that in the Irish context for domestic payments on agriculture, the term results-based is used, and this is the same results-based payments, and this is the same language that is being used in the context of agriculture currently on the carbon farming initiative that the EU is planning to introduce in the context of the Fit for 55 climate package and reference in the farm to fork strategy. And for us, the concern with the term results-based in the context of the climate change policy that the EU is going to unleash, and in particular in terms of carbon accounting, what we think is really important is action-based payments. So there's an example in the report that talks about planting hedgerows and other practices that increase biodiversity, which is great. And the fact that the Irish policy for payments right now is actually disadvantaging farmers who are planting hedgerows and doing that. And so I think it's worth flagging that with the carbon farming initiative, what we need in terms of metrics is really a holistic set of metrics that look at biodiversity indicators, a transformative approach towards less nitrates, ammonia, as the author emphasized in the last report, and not just counting carbon, because it's really critical that we don't get into a game of CO2 offsets in carbon farming, but rather really move towards transformative change where farmers are rewarded for their actions. Another interesting and important aspect of the report is the shift in Irish policy towards expanding milk production and the strategy that resulted in rising emissions and ammonia since 2012. And the emphasis in the report to talk about social innovation and ultimately improving the welfare and well-being of communities. IATP did publish a report last year called Milking the Planet, which looked at the concentration of the dairy industry and rising disenfranchisement of rural communities. And I think it's really critical to see what rising production, lower prices is doing to both emissions and other metrics, as we're talking about in terms of nitrates, ammonia, et cetera, and declining incomes and rural indebtedness. And so wholeheartedly support interventions that are looking at an independent way to assess metrics and a much deeper look at holistic metrics when it comes to agriculture. On the issue of policy coherence on development, so that trade interests don't undermine development goals, and so that low-income countries can achieve their own environmental, social, and cultural needs. The report recommends ratifying the Nagoya Protocol of the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, which acknowledges traditional knowledge, and also reform of the TRIPS agreement that allows for monopoly rights of intellectual property for 20 years or more for agribusinesses. Yes, this is a fundamental issue when it comes to equity, when it comes to low-income countries being able to innovate. But I would also say that it's challenging for Ireland, given that the EU negotiates trade policy on behalf of member states, and there is a strong push in the EU to increase oligopolistic and monopolistic intellectual property rights, not just through the WTO, but through bilateral treaties as well. So I do believe that Ireland can play a critical role, not only in pushing for reform of the TRIPS agreement within the EU, but also to challenge EU trade policy towards its bilateral and regional trade agreements. Also, I would say that a gap in the report is the mention of UPOV 1991 in this context, which is promoted by EU trade policy. UPOV 1991 is a treaty that reinforces oligopolistic intellectual property rights for plant variety protection. And the EU has been quite aggressive in demanding that African countries adopt UPOV 1991, which is under WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization. And I do believe that it's a critical part of protecting farmers' rights and seed biodiversity in the global South. Which brings me to the important sets of recommendations in the report that address power dynamics and the control of agribusiness in both domestic and foreign policy, and what can be done to address it. So for instance, the report highlighted that 43 large firms in Ireland account for 84% of agri-food export wealth. And one of the recommendations was that at least these firms be made to, meet the 25% local milk collection target by ECOWAS. But I would say, and the report goes in depth about these transformative approaches, but I would say that it will take a whole different approach to Irish development policy with a focus to build and strengthen local food systems, and not just procurement of local milk, but also ensuring that local supply chains are not in control of foreign agribusiness, which command drastically asymmetric economic clout on supply chains, and producers with limited ability to receive prices that meet their cost of production. So it's really about ODA and Irish development policy, seeing, how do we actually, from farm to fork within these countries, strengthen local food systems. And local milk procurement is one part of that. And similar to the diversification of Irish agriculture with less and better fruits and vegetables, it's the same kind of diversification and resilience that we want to see in low-income countries. There's also, and I have to applaud some of the recommendations in the report, recommendation 19 and 20, which talk about establishing clear targets to redirect responsibility for regulation firmly in the public sphere. And it's in the context of agribusiness self-regulating. And we've done considerable research on agribusiness self-regulating, on climate targets and climate and emissions accounting. And I think it's the same principle. Unless governments step up to actually have a consistent set of reporting requirements and targets across the sector, it's very hard with a self-regulating mechanism to hold the industry accountable for what it's doing. And exploring pathways to support the increase in the cost of food so that farmers are paid remunerative prices, but alongside having appropriate social safety nets. I'm sure I'm reaching my 5 to 7 minute limit, but I will end with this whole notion about science and the reference in the report about the European Commission's launch of the high-level expert group to assess the needs, options, impacts, and possible approach for an international platform for food system science. And I think I was asked to also mention if there were any gaps in the report, and it's not necessarily a gap because the report already deals with considerable material. So to add any more, I think would have been a really challenging task. But I want to bring attention to the Global Research Alliance on Agricultural Greenhouse Gases, where Ireland is leading in the livestock research group. This alliance is led by New Zealand, but it has 30 other governments. And the whole idea is to see how, as far as I can see, it's actually to support industries' emissions intensity reduction. And in climate jargon, that means per unit of output, reducing the emissions that are produced. And I think what this report is doing is actually advocating for a systems change and a transformative shift. And for that, the research that I see Ireland doing and contributing to in this coalition is about how to reduce methane per cow and cattle. But as we've seen in the case of the increase in herd sizes, if the herd sizes are increasing, you can reduce by changing feed additives and et cetera, maybe the amount of methane each cow emits, but the total amount of methane will still increase. So I think it's an important thing to focus on and to see how do we push Ireland and other countries to actually move towards a system that is less and better. And I will end there. Thanks.
Shefali, thank you so much for that. And I can see already there's numerous questions coming in, which I will put to you, one there about the TRIPS agreement as well, but we'll come to that after we hear from the rest of the panelists. But thank you so much for that. And I'm going to now go to the west of Ireland and introduce John Brennan. John has farmed organically since 1998. I hope everyone can hear me. With a mixed cattle, a rare breed Irish Moyle cattle, mixed cattle and sheep farm in Roscommon. And he's been a member of the Leitrim Organic Farmers Cooperative for over 20 years and been involved with the National Organic Training SkillNet and is a registered agricultural consultant. He's also involved in Talamh Bio, which is probably fair to say Ireland's sort of latest and newest farm organisation of farmers, growers and land-based workers who are lobbying for change to create a better food system in Ireland, where people have access to healthy, nutritious and affordable local food is their pitch and is their goal. So I'm going to introduce John now. John, you're there.
Yes, thanks very much, Ella. Always good to hear from you and meet you again. And great to be asked to be on the panel. I hope everybody can hear me okay. I suppose the first thing is, my first thoughts are, you know, it's great to pick up a report where you start to read it and it starts to make some kind of sense in terms of where our whole agricultural system is at and where it needs to go. And indeed, we only have to follow events from a climate perspective to see that we may not have much time to hang around to implement much of what the report recommends. As Ella said, I've been involved in organic agriculture since 1998. And, you know, Ireland has really no great aspirations for development of the organic sector. When I talk about Ireland, I talk about the people who have generally sort of driven agriculture. So, and that would be people would say from, certain agencies, but also we'll say a lot of the advisory and a lot of, we'll say, the way that agriculture has gone has been driven by agribusiness and those connections, and they're very real, not imagined, between agribusiness and between, you know, we'll say certain elements of advisory and state have basically resulted in pigeonholing organic farming in Ireland. And if we want to put that into the agroecological terms, so I mean, many years ago, I sat down with Trevor Sargent here when he was junior minister, when there was again an aspiration to have 5% of land area, you know, converted to organic farming. Here we are all these years earlier, and I can tell the panel that are listening here, we actually could be facing a reduction in the land area devoted to organic farming. We have a very elderly demographic when it comes to organic farming. We had a lot of farmers who came in when I came in the 90s, and indeed many of them were much older than me, and I see many of them retiring. In fact, in the certain areas of the south, we see a situation where dairy farmers eager for land are paying outrageous sums for any land that they can get. So my concern is that we're actually going to flatline. And in fact, this often results in fact, what I would say business as usual is delighted with this, because what has really happened with organic farmers is we've been trying to promote Ireland as an organic country, which makes complete logic. If you speak to a German or an Austrian, they can't understand why Ireland hasn't gone down and it's been a net exporter of food with a couple of 100 million people on its doorstep. Why it hasn't. And one of my big theory is that agribusiness really can't allow that to happen, because organic is about low input. It's a different type system. There would be some reduction in output, but so I suppose we'd put it in that context. And really where we've got to a stage, and it was interesting when it came to the consultative aspects of the CAP strategic plans. People like me I rarely get asked to be involved in that. A lot of the people who are making the decisions are people who have no skin in the game, organically or from an agroecological point of view. So people attached to we'll say business as usual make decisions that keep organics pigeonholed. So that's really what happened. So I'm delighted that those things have been exposed. Also, again, other things, the complete lack of involvement of women in agriculture. So with the organization Tálaigh Beo, the whole idea has been to have an organization that fundamentally looks at how we're going to feed people in the country through short food supply chain mechanisms, whether that's community supported agriculture, whether it's through box schemes, whether it's through all the things that you don't see in the Farmer's Journal. But these are real, they're not imagined. We need to be in a position where we can reimagine a food system that's local, that's much more diverse. I can see that the charts that were presented there show the fact that we're importing so much in the way of apples and potatoes and cabbage and all the basic things that can be grown here. So what we really need then is to look at the strategy for land use. And again, I welcome the incentives for horticulture. I think again, many of the incentives that are out there for both organics and things like horticulture are quite abysmal, because right now in the last organic farming scheme, and I was a consultant going out to farmers, and they were saying, well, it's going to cost us so much to go into organic farming, and there are all these other competing schemes. I think I'll wait and go into one of them. So what happened was, in the last round, there was 500 places and only 300 were filled. So really, we're not really going anywhere with that. And then Origin Green stands up and says, we're the real green. So what's really happening is that we have farmers now describing themselves as Origin Green farmers. Now, in a world that recognizes organic standards and agroecology, we're not really cutting anybody with that. So I think that really has to be addressed and has to change. And I'm glad that was addressed. Of course, going back to the, again, the Tálaigh Beo already has developed a coherent food policy, and indeed we'd be happy to share that at a later stage. It also, as well, has recently qualified for a European innovation program to look at soil biodiversity. So a very fledgling organization, with big ambitions, but big ambitions not to sort of create large, companies with CEOs, but for family farms, again, to be able to derive, at least a reasonable income from the land, stay in their own communities, work in their own communities, revitalize and re-energize those communities. And again, we would also have those links as well to like La Via Campesina, where we have representation in Europe and links then to peasant farmers in Southern Europe and South America. And the same problems are happening there. So for instance, we have a situation in France where, because of agribusiness interests, you get cheap fruit coming up to compete with small farmers in France. So we have, through the current system, we are basically eliminating small farmers everywhere. And I think even today, I saw the same thing happening in the United States. There has to be a situation where, there's an understanding of the fundamental role of small farmers. We're also losing them in counties like Leitrim here. There's pressures from forestry, much of that forestry damaging monoculture citrus spruce. And of course, there's a lot of pressure to try and get this changed. And of course, the current forestry policy is completely bogged down. But you see, really, until there's a shift in the paradigm, and I think the current climatic events, what we've seen in Germany and worldwide, and it should scare people. People should genuinely be scared of what they're seeing. But really, what we need is a situation where consumers, people who eat the food, have a much greater say in the type of food that that is produced. I welcome as well, one of the things, I think it has been mentioned a couple of times, the whole idea of nutrition. But we now have technology that can measure the food density of food. And I think that has to be a game changer, because if you're producing food in an intensive way that's mining nutrients and maybe not taking up the nutrients into the food, that can be detected. I think we need to use good technology as well for outcomes that sort of say, well, really that food isn't acceptable for human consumption, and therefore that type of food will not receive any subvention from Europe and elsewhere. Again, one of the things that really annoys me as a farmer and who's visited small farmers in South America is to see, first world farmers being subsidized through the EU, dumping commoditized dairy products and so on on markets in Asia and Africa, and then local farmers being driven out of business. I mean, the EU is not there to do that, and subsidization should never be at the core of that. I also believe as well that from the point of view of strategies to support farmers in sub-Saharan Africa, that has to be empowered, to empower local farmers and to give them the tools and means to grow food and to derive a decent income for themselves. So, I mean, these are just some of the things I think the report also points out as well that there, and it's coming through in several places, that really the people who are involved or who could potentially drive forward agroecology are not really there. For instance, the role of the National Organic Training Skill Net that has run several biological and regenerative farming conferences, and Ella, you have been there yourself chairing these. And then really, you know, the state agency Chaga should be really more involved in this as well, and it should be taking more heed on what the best international practice, you know, when it comes to soils, because soils fundamentally are under threat everywhere. And if we really intend to have productive soils, which will give us nutritious food, we have to really go back there. We have to move away from simply just dumping nitrogen and chemicals and pesticides onto soil and expecting that they will continue to generate quality food. And also remember that the ultimate, when we talk there, and it was mentioned about the fizzy drinks that people are, and the poor quality food, that's the burden that's going to be paid for by the taxpayer through the health system, because really chronic illness is at the root of an awful lot of our health problems. And of course, we can bring that back to you know, the industrial food complex again. So I think there's a lot of politics in this, but we have to start somewhere. I think the environmental pillar pulling out of the food strategy 2030 was a really brave move. I think it was an important move, and I think it was saying, look, business as usual cannot be the only show in town. We have a broken agricultural system in many respects, maybe not from a profit point of view, but if profit is the only metric, then we know where that's going to go. I mean, we are the biggest crisis when COVID is over, and it will be a sideshow. The climate crisis will be the biggest challenge. Components and recommendations in here to start developing or to start dealing with some of the worst aspects of this, but also to help us to regenerate our soils, our forests, our land, to try and to be part of, we'll say, a new farming paradigm that respects people, biodiversity, you know, the individual, but fundamentally that respects nature and respects the right of all people to, you know, to live decent, normal, dignified lives on the planet. Thank you.
John, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. And there again has been some comments coming in, which we will put afterwards to you. And a nice comment there from Sean saying, great comprehensive presentation, and thank you to Sinead for that. I'm going to move on now to Gertrude Trilali Jabson, who is the country coordinator for the Participatory Ecological Land Use Management in Zimbabwe. Gertrude is a social entrepreneur, an award-winning journalist, and a feminist. And she has extensive experience on diverse social issues, working with marginalized groups in Southern Africa. And for the past 15 years or so, she's been working with civil society organizations to raise consciousness on agroecology, food systems, gender, information and communication technologies, and livelihoods on practical and political intervention level. And she holds an MSc degree in development studies and a bachelor's degree in journalism and media studies. We're delighted to have her join us. Gertrude, thank you very much. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Ella. And my apologies, I'm struggling with my internet. So when I start having some problems, you'll see me switching off my internet. I will first start to say that the report, I found it very interesting. And I think it comes at the right time, particularly when many countries in Africa are also in the process of trying to develop an African food policy under the auspice of the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa. And I know that more than 20 countries in Africa are going through the process of redefining their food systems so that they are transformative. And I come in to bring in the voice from Africa or from the South, and looking really at the voices of women, the views of low-income women, smallholder farmers, how that can be integrated in the development cooperation partners, country-making processes on sustainable food systems. Just drawing from the experience and practices in Africa and looking at the diversity of from the African continent, I feel that it's very important to go through an unrushed consultation process. This is a process that needs to engage these low-income earning women, the smallholder farmers who form the bulk of the agricultural force in Africa. And these women have to be put at the fore of the conversations. Some of the practices that could be ideal include holding a series of community dialogues in which women, knowledgeable elders who are often forgotten in development processes are included. The dialogues could also target youth and men, where they come together to analyze and reflect on their situation. They take the lead, identify barriers and their own priorities through an unhurried communication process with listening at the heart. I feel that in most cases, when consultation is done, it's rushed. And I think we saw that from the video that was shown, that the consultations that are done, really, it's a joke, I'll tell you. In Africa, you find that consultations are happening in urban areas, and even looking within the context of COVID, people cannot travel. Consultations are being done online, and we know about the digital divide. So there is need to seriously consider a process that really provides that opportunity to hear the voices of communities, particularly women, the smallholder farmers who form the bulk of the labor force in the agricultural sector. I think there's also need to gain a deep understanding of traditional ecological knowledge and its ecological governance system that can actually enable communities to weave the biocultural systems back to life. And I think this is something that has been pointed out in the research, that there's need to consider the aspects of traditional knowledge within the processes to revive our food systems. But in the context of Africa, there is that, I would say, lack of recognition of the value of indigenous knowledge, and that is fundamental, and how that is fundamental in conservation of plant genetic resources for food and agriculture, something that is quite key when we talk about biodiversity, and especially if we are referring to issues to do with seeds. And I'm happy that Shafali pointed out the issue around UPOF 91 and the push in Africa, and how the seed in Africa is being captured by corporates. And I feel that this is something that the report should put more emphasis on. Then looking at how developing partner countries like Ireland can ensure these views are supported through their country programs, I feel that there is need to have strategic allocation of resources to support local efforts that can advance agroecological farming practices. What we have seen over the past 3, 4, 5 decades really is an aggressive focus on investment that is channeled towards advancing industrial agriculture. And there has been really less emphasis on sustaining supporting agricultural practices that are in line with nature and that actually help us to save our planet. And I think when your house is on fire, priority needs to be given to allocate resources on practices that regenerate our landscapes. Some of these practices, women's food, their seed, and also their climate resilience. And I think second, there is need to strengthen institutions in low income, that work with low income women, small scale farmers, so that they can strengthen their capacity to implement agriculture. Also need to build their confidence so that they are able to articulate their issues and concerns at different platforms. So when consultations are done, they are able to voice their concerns. We also need to take into account that in Africa, there is patriarchy prevents women from participating in decision-making processes. And the report talks about potentials of having partnerships in Africa. And I think it's very important to begin to find ways to dismantle those power relations and ensure that women have got their voices heard when they present their issues. And strengthening of institution is also vital. The institutions will be able to work with farmers, bring their voices at international level, at country level, so that they can advocate for sustainable food systems that are ecologically sound, socially just, and also economically. Then just looking at the report, not necessarily looking at the gaps, but bringing in a different perspective as well. I think it's important to have an earth-centered approach in our programming. If it's more of a human-centered approach, there is also the danger of forgetting that we cannot exist without the existence of other life forms, the rivers, the mountains. And even when we interact as indigenous communities, we acknowledge the importance of how, as humans, we are deeply connected to all forms of life. I think there's also, as mentioned earlier, on the need to tap into ancient knowledge and wisdom and see how we can revive these, because for many years they have been the basis for the conservation of the diversity that we find in Africa, especially when you look at sacred natural sites and territories. And I think the conversation around revival of this traditional knowledge is to bring in the question to say, how can we reconnect with the wild? Because within agriculture, we need to bring that link between the farmland and the wilderness. And that link is very important, particularly for diversity and also ensuring the resilience of communities, especially if we are talking about the provision of ensuring that there is food and seed sovereignty. We really need to integrate the wild within the conversations that we're having. Then lastly, I would just borrow from what Thomas Berry says. Thomas Berry is the father of Earth jurisprudence, and he talks about the need for humans to reconnect with the broader web of life. And I feel that perhaps if we bring in the conversation, the language around the need to reconnect with the wild, the need to reconnect with other forms of life, then we find that even when we begin to have conversations about what we can do as humans, we are really fitting into the broader ecosystem and finding a way of dancing to enhance that the web of life is sustained. Thank you so much, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Gertrude. And it is so good to hear about the importance of listening to women, particularly those from low backgrounds, and also listening to our knowledgeable elders as well. I'm delighted finally to introduce Tom Arnold. He is Ireland's Special Envoy on Food Systems, whose role it is to communicate Ireland's position and policy priorities in the run-up to and during, of course, the UN Food Systems Summit in November this year. Tom is a former Chief Executive of Concern Worldwide from 2001 to 2013, and he served on a number of high-level bodies, including the UN Millennium Project's Hunger Task Force and the Irish Hunger Task Force as well. He's also a member of the UN Food System Summit's Champions Group, and has recently been appointed by the European Commission to chair a new high-level expert group. Tom chaired the Irish government's 2030 Agri-Food Strategy Committee, which produced the draft report. Thank you so much for joining us, Tom.
Thank you very much, Ella, and indeed it's a pleasure to be part of this. I'd first like to commend Trócaire and Oxfam for commissioning this report, and indeed commissioning Sinead to produce it. I think it's a very challenging report, and that's all to the good. I think we are moving towards, I think, a more substantial debate about the future of our national agri-food policy, and this is going to be part of that debate. Sinead started by talking about the paradigm shift that the Food System Summit and the approach to working with food systems represents, and she's entirely right about that. And she also noted that the strategy, that the 2030 strategy that we've been working upon, is the first strategy, I think, national strategy to be developed using a food systems approach. Therefore, there's a great deal of interest in it, both in the process by which it was developed and also in what it will eventually say. And here I'd just like to bring you up to date with where it's at. Sinead's report was based on, if you like, the draft strategy that was produced in mid-April. That went for a public consultation. It was the subject of these 4 food systems dialogues, debates that went on. But it was also, in response to that public consultation, some 97 submissions were made. And that has led to considerable adjustment of the draft strategy. And we hope it will be finalized. Well, it is finalized, but it will be launched next week, to the best of my knowledge. That's my understanding of where things are at. And I think well, people can judge when it's produced, but in my view, it does represent a substantial innovation by comparison to any previous strategy. Firstly, it's done using this food systems approach, which explicitly links the policy for food, policy for the environment, and policy for health. That's the first time that has been done. Secondly, particularly of relevance to this audience, it talks about the need for policy coherence between our domestic policy on sustainable food systems and our foreign policy, particularly our development cooperation policy. The core of it is that we were asked to produce a vision for 2030, which would achieve the balance between the economic, environmental, and social sustainability. I think we've done our best to do that, and I think we've made a reasonable job of it. But what essentially we've done is set down a set of policy directions, policy principles that should guide national policy for the next decade. There's going to be a number of other decisions to be taken along the way. But the key thing is that if government agrees and operates according to these policy principles, I think it will represent, by comparison to where we've been at up to now, a significant change. And here we're talking about, one of the areas in which will achieve, which attracts most attention is obviously the issue of the environment, the links between agri-food policy and the environment. And here we start with a legacy. And that legacy was Foodwise 2025. And there was a principle articulated at the beginning, which said that economic sustainability and environmental sustainability would be given equal importance. Now, that did not happen, as it turned out. And I've been very clear as we developed our strategy, that could not happen again, that the 2030 strategy, its credibility had to be based on the fact that there could, if a principle like that is articulated, then it had to be delivered on. And so at the heart of our strategy is an equivalence, if you like, that economic, environmental, and social sustainability all are of critical importance. And we've set out policies to deliver on that. In terms of the environmental challenge, there is no doubt that there are existing environmental problems in terms of water quality in particular. And Ella, I saw you wrote an excellent article in the Irish Times about 3 weeks ago on that. Water quality, emissions, and biodiversity loss. These are problems that have to be addressed as a matter of urgency. What we have done in the strategy is set out targets to be achieved by 2030, but in advance of, as the starting point towards working towards those targets, there is going to have to be a significant action, particularly around the adjustment of ag climatize to deal with the immediate problems. We set the 2030 targets in the context of a longer term vision of the sector achieving climate neutrality by 2050, in line with national policy. So that's where that's a crucial starting point. And just a further addition here is that ag climatize in its drafted form has to be adjusted to take account of updated targets set out in the Climate Action Bill, and including the 5-year carbon budgets that will be set. Now, in the short term, I would submit that the dairy sector has a particular role to play in advancing and coming up with programs of action which address these urgent issues in the short term and as a prelude to a longer term contribution. The other novelty and innovation, I think, of our strategy is indeed the focus that is on nutrition, the link between food and health in particular. We say that that issue needs to be brought to a new level of political and policy importance. And I think it's true in Ireland, but it's true elsewhere in the world as well. In terms of Africa, there were various comments made by Ella. My view is that Africa, that the Food System Summit represents, and it was reflected there in the last contribution from Gertrude, represent an opportunity for Africa to begin to rethink their policy. And at the heart of African economic policy over the next decades has to be the transformation of their agricultural sectors. And central to that will be African governments setting out a clear and consistent policy for their agricultural sectors, embedded in a wider rural development framework. And I think there is a real role for Europe and Africa and Ireland and Africa to play in coming together. I'd just like to finish by talking about the unique nature of 2021. We have a food system summit. As was said at the beginning by Sinead, this is only the 5th time in over 50 years when the world has had a summit on food. And in each of those other occasions, there were significant outcomes came from those summits, policy changes, the establishment of new institutions. And that, I think, is the challenge that we face here in this year. But the Food System Summit is just a stepping stone. There are 3 other important summits for the rest of the year. There's the COP26, there's the Biodiversity COP, and there's the Nutrition for Growth. Now, I believe that our national policy, and particularly what we have in the 2030 strategy, provides a basis for Ireland to make a significant contribution to each of these summits. And I look forward to our ministers and whatever small role I can play in doing that as well. So I'll leave it at that, Ella, for the moment, and hopefully that will leave some time for questions.
Tom, thank you so much for that. And indeed, it does feel like this year is such a critical year for food policy and foreign policy in general. you know, we've just heard a very wide range of points made in response to Sinead's presentation. I was going to summarize them, but I'm actually really much more interested in putting some of the questions to people and not using up our valuable time. So I'm going to jump straight in, because we have, I would say, about 10 minutes or so to discuss some of the issues that have been raised there. I want to go first to you, Shefali. We have a question here about the TRIPS agreement, the Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, from Jeff Tansey. And he asks, what specific changes do you want to WTO TRIPS agreement? What's the political dynamic in Ireland EU that would see these recommendations acted on? Can I ask you to answer that, Shefali?
Sure, I can come in. It's a bit of a cheeky question from Jeff Tansey, because I know him from my days in Geneva. He's quite a TRIPS expert himself and can answer this question. But
we're not letting anyone else come in apart from the panelists.
But yeah, I mean, we had huge issues when TRIPS was created and agreed, and the whole idea of 20-year patent protections gives industry and agribusiness huge rights for monopolistic control. It has certainly been a challenge, and mostly seen in the context of medicines and compulsory licensing issues. But the whole issue is the agreement itself is pretty bad. So how would you reform it short of actually starting over and revising it? But the challenge also, as I indicated in my response, is that it's kind of the baseline for bilateral and regional treaties and the way that the EU negotiates. And hence this push for UPOV 1991, extreme plant variety protection for seed companies, and taking away the space for innovative and progressive legislation from African countries. And I'm sure Gertrude can come in here and give very concrete examples, but there's been a tremendous amount of pressure on African governments to adopt UPOV 1991, which limits their ability to be able to actually have legislation that supports small-scale farmers. So yeah, and you know, there's been a whole campaign on no patents on life, and the whole idea that with biotechnology you can change certain aspects in genes, etc., and then have patent protection. So these are the kinds of issues that we would want to see reformed and enable farmers to be able to save and share seeds.
And Sinead, can I bring you in there as well, just briefly, if you can, to answer the question from Jeff with regards to the specific changes you'd like to see, but also the perhaps more critical question of the political dynamic within Ireland?
Yeah, thanks, Ella, and thanks, Jeff, for coming in. Certainly, I agree, Jeff is probably better placed to respond to this question, but specifically in the report, and I certainly take the comments from Shefali and Gertrude that UPOV is a gap in the report. I suppose that touches specifically on the question that Jeff raises in terms of where does Ireland's role come in here, which is what the focus of the report is. And so I suppose we focus particularly on the TRIPS agreement and Article 27.3b specifically, which looks at the protection of plant varieties using patents. And here we raise the point that in low-income countries today, and previously even more so, a farmer's livelihood is often based on being able to sell, exchange, and develop seeds best suited to their own agroecological context. And under the regimes that we're currently working within, the privatization of biodiversity means, first of all, a reduction of genetic diversity and availability of diverse, nutritious diets for smallholder farmers. But it also implies the risk of costly legal action for these farmers at times. And then there's the question of appropriation of knowledge as well. So to benefit research on new plant varieties without compensating the communities who might have nurtured those organisms over generations. And so that's where we focused in on the Nagoya Protocol of ensuring the equitable benefits ensuring the equitable sharing rather of benefits that arise from the utilization of these genetic resources. So in terms of the dynamic between Ireland and the EU, it's a question I don't have the full scope of knowledge to answer, frankly. But what I do think is that as Ireland is in this position at the global level, as rightly so a leader in terms of its development cooperation, but also as part of the UN Security Council and the role it plays in IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, and then its other spheres with Ireland's strong reputation, I think if we do develop further this reputation as a leader in this field, then we bring legitimacy to the table and we can start advocating on behalf of those who don't have such a strong role at the table, specifically at the EU level, to bring about the changes that Shefali and Gertrude mentioned and that we mentioned in the report.
Okay, and just very briefly, Jim, I'll bring you in there with the point that Shefali made herself, that Ireland can play a critical role when it comes to the TRIPS agreement. Do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, obviously the seat at the UN Security Council is quite significant.
Well, look, I think, you know, at times Ireland's international position can be a bit contradictory, and you know, there's a lot of goodwill and a lot of support across Ireland for its broadly positive engagement internationally, whether it be in international development, now at the UN Security Council, and so many spaces. So it needs to be, you know, in order to reinforce that, it needs to be a credible and strong voice in other spaces as well, including on TRIPS. And you know, we're also talking about TRIPS in relation to the vaccine situation. And you know, Ireland is currently, I know that's not for this discussion today, but Ireland is currently, along with the EU, blocking the waiver in relation to vaccine production. So it just, you know, it needs to reinforce its own international reputation by, you know, sometimes taking courageous steps in more controversial or challenging spaces that it finds itself in, and it's you know, we have research showing that the vast majority of the Irish public support this. So you know, I think the political establishment sometimes can be behind the public on some of these, and you know, I think that there's strong evidence to suggest that. But look, we're looking forward to the publication of the report, as Tom has described, and I mean that the strategy, I should say, and the idea that the three key pillars are going to be balanced is an exciting proposition if, you know, if the policies that are going to be outlined will be followed through and delivered on.
Okay, thank you. And Gertrude, if you're there, perhaps turn your video on. I know you've got a shaky internet connection, but if you're there to answer a question, maybe put your video on so I know that you can hear me. And there you are. Gertrude, a question for you from Stuart G. Genetic resources. Gertrude, can you hear me okay? Super. So this is a question for you. Genetic resources and seeds in Africa have been mentioned a few times. My experience, says Stuart, of public good seed systems versus private seed companies would be that private seed companies have been much better at developing quality seeds and getting them to market than public systems. We need to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Gertrude, what do you make of that?
So I will draw response from practical knowledge on the ground, especially after working with farmers for more than 7 years in working to strengthen farmer managed seed systems. What I've seen on the ground, farmers do have the capacity to produce seed, and they are the holders and custodians of these traditional seeds. Even when the companies come to want to develop seed, they go back to farmers for that diversity. They hold the gene pool. So I think there is need to recognize the important role that farmers play, particularly in research and enhancing these biodiversity, their conservation. And I feel that there's need to recognize the important role that farmers play. I'm not saying we need to be out with the water, but then there's need to also place more emphasis and recognizing the role played by farmers.
Gertrude, you emphasize very strongly the importance of the voices of women, particularly low-income women, and also older people in the community who have built up so much knowledge. And I just wonder, looking towards the UN Food Summit later this year, are you satisfied that those voices will come through at that sort of international level or not?
Currently, we're even struggling to get the voices at national level. So you find that when consultations are being done, they are being in areas, and usually the people there are the technical who say there is very little consultation and interaction with knowledgeable elders on the ground, and also the women who are the custodians of seed. I feel that the voices of these critical players in the conservation of plant genetic resources for agriculture is being undermined because of little consultation, and there is very little effort that is being made to reach out to these women and the knowledgeable elders to get their input in the decision-making processes.
Thank you, Gertrude. Tom, I have a question here from Niamh Garvey, who says, thank you to all the panelists for a very interesting discussion. A question for Tom. What role does Tom see for a just transition approach for agriculture in Ireland? And are there any lessons learnt from the stakeholder engagement process for the 2030 strategy that could inform stakeholder engagement in developing a just transition approach for agriculture?
We're very clear in our strategy that a just transition approach is absolutely essential. There's a lot of big changes to happen over the next decade. They can't all happen at once. They have to happen in staged processes. So I would see that we are talking about a set of, out of the long list of recommendations that we have made in our strategy, just as Sinead's document represents a very long list as well. In both cases, we're going to have to make choices of where the priorities are, and then go about it, because we have to bring people along with you if you have to achieve change. And at the heart of that has to be the process of just transition. So we're very clear that that applies for the next decade in Ireland, but also I think as a general principle, it should apply in the approach used in our development cooperation policies overseas.
And Tom, given you're our envoy, I wondered, your answer to the question I put to Gertrude, which is, are you satisfied that the necessary voices will come through for the UN Food Summit in particular, but obviously in general with these international summits that are happening, trying to address these issues? Are you satisfied that the voices of women in particular, low-income communities and countries are coming through sufficiently?
I know there's a genuine concern about this at the Food System Summit level. I know there's been a great effort from the beginning that those voices should come through. So, for example, in regard to indigenous knowledge, etc. But at the end of the day, these same principles have to apply at national level. I was on a call this morning with young people, organized by youth, if you like, as part of the Food System Summit. And that was a constant refrain that was coming through when we were talking to 6 different countries about putting structures in place, having it commonplace that young people are listened to, young people are given a place at the table. So I think the Food System Summit is an opportunity to, in a sense, embed some of those basic principles much more generally around the world.
John, thank you, Tom. John, just to bring you in as well before we have to finish up, and it's a pity because we've got so many questions, but such is life. Some people have said, thank you, John, for your presentation. Again, Stuart G said some great points made by John there. He said that he agrees with some points that you've made with some reservations. He says, I think shifting the power in the food systems is a prerequisite to transforming the system, but what would this look like? What or who should be the accountable body to drive the transformation that is envisaged? And just take yourself off mute, please.
Thanks, Ella. I think that's a very good point that he at the moment, you see that the difficulty is farming is represented by different farming organizations, whether it's the IFA, ICMSA, ICSA, and they generally are for the most part involved in business as usual farming. I think Talamh Beo has been the first organization to emerge that's independent, that based on the philosophy around food sovereignty, short supply chains, climate justice, that basically puts the food producer at the center of everything, that it's not concerned about inputs from agribusiness or the wider agribusiness philosophy. So I think that organization has a role to play. I think the report, though, I think there should be a role for an organization like Talamh Beo at a national level, informing, we'll say, food and how food should be, grown, produced, and then delivered. And also, as well, we also need to have, as well as centralized distribution, which is very much at risk. I mean, if we take, just how fragile, food systems are, you could quite easily, with a crop failure in the US or somewhere else, find that certain countries are suffering from shortages. So again, I think that idea that we need a more diverse agriculture, that we need to promote more horticulture and farming. Of course, you'll be told all the time that Ireland should just continue to produce beef and dairy because that's what it's good at. That's not the point. We have a duty to make sure that we're food secure as a country. We also need to make sure we're food sovereign, that the food that's being produced is appropriate. It's appropriate culturally, it's appropriate nutritionally. And I would argue that there's an awful lot of food that we're producing, that's quite doubtful about some of the nutritional value of it. So again, these are important issues. So I take the point that at the moment, people that are talking this kind of language probably are very underrepresented at any forum nationally.
And finally, thank you, John. Finally, to you, Sinead, for the last word. One imagines on that particular point that the idea of a national sustainable food systems body could be a place where there is arguably greater representation of a wider range of voices with regard to this critical question that affects all of us about food policy and farm policy.
Yeah, sure, Ella. Sorry, I'm not sure I actually got the question itself there, though.
The question being, is that one way to address the power imbalance that you yourself have outlined within your report?
Yeah, thanks, Ella. Yeah, I do. I believe that this could be, and this was a recommendation that came up in kind of different formats in the various conversations we had over the last few months. And I think what's really key here, and I'll just say this, and then I'll leave it, is the idea that it's independent and open to the public. And to touch on some of the other questions that came through, including regarding the CGIAR system, I think that is something that doesn't get discussed enough, but this idea of taking research and development back into the public sphere. So while some might feel that it's less effective, I think that's part of this. It's part of a misguided view we have on the role of government and the public sector, which can be a lot more innovative, and in fact has proven to be so prior to this shift that we've seen over the latter 50, 40, 60 years. So yes, I think and I hope that Ireland can develop some form of entity that encompasses the massive array and complexity of what government and every stakeholder has to deal with to try and work together towards listening and feeling, as David Nabarro said, and towards effective monitoring and evaluation.
Well, thank you for that. And there are a lot of comments thanking all of you, and you in particular, Sinead, for your clear presentation, and all of you for your contributions. And I'm only sorry that, first of all, I'm a little bit over time, but also we don't have more time to go through all these greater points. But thank you so much, Sinead, Shifali, Gertrude, John, and Tom. And I'm now delighted to hand you over to Trócaire CEO Caoimhe de Barra, who's going to give us some closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Ella, and thanks to all of you for your participation. I think this has been a fascinating session and an incredibly important one in the context of everything that we have heard today about the global summits and discussions that are happening, but also the discussions that will need to continue to happen in Ireland around our food systems, as well as internationally, following up on the summits that are due to happen. I'd like to underline a few points that have been made in the course of the conversation. First of all, the urgency of the issues that we are dealing with. Jim in his introduction, Sinead, Tom in his remarks, and many others highlighted the importance of making progress on these issues, given the interconnected challenges of food insecurity, biodiversity loss, climate change, and ultimately delivery of all of the Sustainable Development Goals. As a result, the political focus in Ireland and internationally on food systems is both essential and welcome. Food system is being defined as a system that it enables economic, social, and environmental sustainability is critical. And as Tom has said, this is a sea change in how we consider food and nutrition security, and that's very, very welcome. From Trócaire and Oxfam's perspective, a transformation is needed whereby food policies are clearly centred on human rights, social equity, women's empowerment, and on economic security and prosperity, but one which is based on environmental regeneration and resilience building to climate change and other shocks. So in producing this report, we are trying to put out a really clear call to Ireland and others who might be influenced by such a report, that Ireland would ensure its leadership on sustainable food systems includes all of these elements. And I would underline human rights, social equity, and women's empowerment in particular. It's very good to hear Tom speaking about the revisions that have been happening to the agri-food strategy, which I really look forward to reading next week, and also the emphasis within it on a just transition, because a just transition is going to be essential in Ireland, but also globally. I think what's very clear as a result of this conversation today is that there is an absolute need for further strengthening of inclusive decision-making processes at national level as well as at global level. Listening to Gertrude, I think we all understand very clearly, because she so articulately presents the picture of what is actually happening in the countries where the people who are most affected by the impacts of climate change and the impacts of food insecurity, and whose traditional knowledge is also being eroded and being commoditized and corporatized. So I think we really have to pay very close attention to how can representation and inclusion be meaningful and focus on those who have been disproportionately excluded from global processes and national processes, whether that's in Ireland or Zimbabwe or other countries. So we, Trócaire and Oxfam, and our partners are advocating for sustainable transformations that support small-scale food producers around the world. These transformations, by their nature, are context-specific, but they should protect everyone's right to food as an absolute priority while sustaining the natural resources upon which agriculture relies. The report points to Ireland's very strong commitment to addressing hunger and malnutrition, and Ireland is rightly known for this. And Tom, I'd like to acknowledge Tom's work as well, his work over the course of almost a lifetime in this area. But the report does find that Ireland's ODA support for food and nutrition security needs to be more clearly directed towards sustainable and agroecological initiatives that are intentionally focused on, as Gertrude clearly spoke about, the need to regenerate our landscapes and protect and promote traditional ecological knowledge. At the moment, it's clear that only a minority of ODA spending, as currently defined, is directed towards intentionally sustainable agriculture projects. So that is clearly an area where there is a lot of practical progress that can be made around the nature of policy implementation, because I do believe that a better world intends these outcomes to happen, but it's around the nature of policy implementation. Gertrude also spoke very strongly about the need for meaningful engagement of women, and I think we cannot overlook this. Climate change, food insecurity, conflict, COVID, all of these disproportionately affect women and disproportionately affect poor rural women. Therefore, having a gendered analysis of every policy, and there are many in that map that was produced so beautifully and presented by Sinead, but having a gendered analysis is critical, because if we do not have a gendered analysis, number one, we will miss many of the solutions, but number two, we will continue to leave women disproportionately affected by all these issues and left to mop up the outcome of processes that are inherently unequal and unfair. I think the very last point that was made there is really important, which is the attention that the report draws to the value of establishing an independent national sustainable food systems body. The content, the complexity of the agri-food strategy almost points to this in itself, because it's such a broad-ranging policy. It is so important. As Tom said, it is going to be incredibly important that there is some form of implementation mechanism which is very strong, which ensures that the government, through its policy measures and the implementation thereof, fulfills the principles that we look forward to seeing in that policy next week. But how can this assurance be developed? So I think that recommendation around an independent national sustainable food systems body with a monitoring mandate and a policy influence mandate is extremely important. And I think that would also, should it be established in a way which is representative of all of the different stakeholders, address some of the power imbalances that have been discussed in the course of this conversation. Another point that was very important that has been made several times, but just to draw attention to it, is the disproportionate influence of corporates on overall policy. I thought the video at the outset was very interesting because it sort of showed that counterintuitively, if you have a multi-stakeholder, very open system, who gets to influence most? Well, clearly it will be those with greatest resources and greatest voice and greatest access. Therefore, we have to always intentionally consider leave no one behind, but the furthest behind first. So the people disproportionately impacted by poverty, conflict, COVID, food insecurity should be first, should be the people whose voices are elevated in all of the processes that we're speaking about in terms of food systems. So I know time is very short, so I will draw to a close. I really hope that the publication of this report and today's launch will engender further purposeful debate. And as one of the speakers said, the debate and robust debate is now beginning in Ireland on Irish food systems. And I think we really welcome that and welcome an opportunity to contribute to that, as well as to the Global UN Food Systems Summit. Ireland definitely has a very strong opportunity to demonstrate its support for democratic, inclusive and participatory agriculture and food governance systems through its participation in the UN Food Summit pre-summit, which is happening next week, and the summit in autumn, but also post-summit. And this is going to be achieved, I think, primarily by articulating support for strengthening the mandate and role of some of the most inclusive forums, including the Committee on World Food Security and the Rome-based multilateral agencies. So finally, on behalf of the co-hosts of this event, Oxfam Ireland and Trócaire, I would like to thank firstly the report's lead researcher and author, Sinead Moles, and to recognise the huge work that she has put into the writing of this paper and its preparation and the presentation here today, which was so clear. I would like to thank all of our speakers, the panelists, Shefali Sharma, John Brennan, Gertrude Chowari Jabson, Tom Arnold. And I would also like to highly thank our expert moderator, Ella McSweeney, for everything that you've brought to this process and today's event. I'd like to thank everyone who registered and who participated today, who has contributed questions and who has taken something away from this. We do believe that this is an initial discussion. We welcome further discussion on the report. The summary and the recommendations, as well as the full report, can be downloaded from Trócaire and Oxfam Ireland's websites. And I would recommend or encourage everyone to go and to have a look at the full report. And finally, we will send you some links to what has been presented today to all participants in today's event. So with that, I would like to hand you back over to Ella McSweeney. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for that. And all I can say is thank you to everyone for their involvement. It's been such an interesting 2 hours. The report is available. I saw someone asking for the report. Sinead, perhaps you can post that there. The link to the report to make sure that everyone has it. And I know that this recording will be available and circulated by Trócaire and Oxfam as well. But thank you very much, everyone. And I'm going to sign off now.